They gave him 24 hours, a deadline, an ultimatum, backed by one of the most powerful nations on earth. The message was clear: comply or face the consequences. Most leaders would have folded. Most leaders would have made a quiet phone call, signed whatever paper was put in front of them, and pretended it never happened. But Ibrahim Traoré didn't sleep that night to think about surrendering. He spent it building his response. And when morning came, he didn't blink. What happened next didn't just shock France. It lit up an entire continent. This is the story they don't want you to understand. A government received a 24-hour ultimatum. The demand was simple: reverse your decisions, realign with Western interests, or face consequences. The leader who received it did not panic. He did not flee. He did not comply. Instead, Ibrahim Traoré, the 36-year-old captain who now governs one of West Africa's most strategically significant nations, spent that night in consultation, and by morning issued a statement that would reverberate far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. His message was measured, deliberate, and pointed. Burkina Faso's sovereignty, he declared, was not subject to external deadlines. That single sentence cracked open a fault line that has been quietly widening beneath the Sahel for years. And the world is only beginning to understand what it means. To understand why this moment carries the weight that it does, you have to understand what Burkina Faso actually is, and what it has been forced to be for most of its modern history. Landlocked, mineral-rich, and perpetually squeezed between competing external powers, Burkina Faso sits at the geographic heart of West Africa. It borders 6 countries: Mali to the north and west, Niger to the east, Benin, Togo, and Ghana to the south, and Côte d'Ivoire to the southwest. Its population is young, largely rural, and deeply proud of a national identity that traces back to the revolutionary era of Thomas Sankara, the Pan-Africanist leader assassinated in 1987, whose legacy has never fully left the country's political imagination. For decades, Burkina Faso was drawn into the orbit of France, its former colonial power, through a web of agreements that critics have long described as neo-colonial in character. Military cooperation, monetary policy through the CFA franc, intelligence-sharing protocols, and extractive contracts in gold, zinc, and manganese all tied the country's strategic decisions to external approval. This was not an arrangement that Burkinabe citizens uniformly embraced, but it was one that successive governments, often installed or stabilized through opaque external mechanisms, maintained regardless. That arrangement began fracturing visibly in 2022. In January of that year, a military coup removed President Marc Christian Kabore, who had been struggling to contain an escalating jihadist insurgency in the country's north and east. The military junta that took power initially promised a transitional return to civilian rule. But by September 2022, a second coup had occurred. This one led by Captain Ibrahim Traoré, who at 34 became one of the youngest heads of state in the world. What followed was not the predictable consolidation of authoritarian power that Western governments and international observers typically describe when a coup happens in Africa. What followed was something more complicated, more ideologically charged, and more consequential for the region. Traoré moved quickly to reframe the terms of Burkina Faso's sovereignty. He expelled French military forces, ending a cooperation agreement that had kept French troops on Burkinabe soil. He terminated the presence of French special operations units whose mandate, according to Ouagadougou, was never fully transparent. He began renegotiating mineral extraction contracts that activists and local economists had long criticized as deeply disadvantageous to the country. And he pursued closer relationships with Russia, including reported engagement with forces linked to what is now commonly described as the Africa Corps, formerly known as the Wagner Group, as well as with other non-Western partners. These were not symbolic gestures. Each decision had material consequences for the parties who had previously benefited from the old arrangement. And that, analysts argue, is precisely why an ultimatum was issued. The details of the ultimatum point to a set of specific demands that Burkina Faso reverse agreements it had recently signed, agreements touching on foreign surveillance infrastructure and the restructuring of mineral contracts. These were not abstract policy concerns. Surveillance agreements in the context of the Sahel involve intelligence architecture, who has access to signals data, communications monitoring, and potentially military-relevant information flows across the region. Mineral contracts involve gold, one of Burkina Faso's most significant export commodities, and the renegotiation of those contracts was a direct challenge to established commercial interests that had operated for years with preferential terms. The ultimatum, framed within a 24-hour window, was understood by Traoré's government and by citizens who would soon take to the streets as an attempt by external powers, with France and its Western allies cited prominently in that framing, to force a reversal through deadline pressure rather than diplomatic negotiation. Whether the ultimatum was formally issued through official channels or applied through the kind of indirect, back-channel pressure that characterizes much of contemporary geopolitical coercion matters less, in some respects, than the fact that it was perceived as real, acted upon as real, and produced a response that was entirely and deliberately public. This is where the stakes become clear. Traoré did not refuse the ultimatum quietly, through a communiqué buried in the official gazette. He refused it in a way that created a public record, a political moment, and, crucially, a mobilizing event. As news of the ultimatum and his refusal spread through Ouagadougou and beyond, Burkinabe citizens did something that governments operating under external pressure rarely get to witness. They came out. In public squares, on streets, in town centers across the country, people gathered, not summoned by a state apparatus in the way authoritarian regimes mobilize crowds, but in the kind of organic, visible, emotionally charged way that signals a population that feels its national dignity is under direct assault. Flags were raised. The language of sovereignty moved from political speeches into the vocabulary of ordinary citizens. And what had begun as a diplomatic confrontation between Ouagadougou and unnamed external powers became, within hours, a referendum on the terms of Burkina Faso's place in the world. It would be easy and politically convenient for some to dismiss this popular response as manufactured, as the product of government propaganda or the kind of nationalist performance that authoritarian leaders often orchestrate when they need legitimacy cover. But that interpretation struggles against a deeper history. Burkinabe society has a long memory. The name of the country itself changed from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso by Thomas Sankara in 1984, translates roughly to Land of the Upright People. That naming was not incidental. It was a statement of national character, and it has persisted through decades of subsequent political upheaval precisely because it resonates with something real in the population's self-understanding. When Traoré invoked sovereignty in refusing the ultimatum, he was speaking in a frequency that Burkinabe citizens had been tuned to for 40 years. He was not creating that sentiment. He was channeling it. The regional resonance was immediate. Across the Sahel, in Mali, in Niger, in Chad, across the wider arc of Francophone West Africa, the moment was watched closely. Mali and Niger, both of which have undergone their own military-led transitions in recent years, and both of which have similarly moved to expel French military and diplomatic presence, receive the news as a data point in an ongoing regional realignment. The Alliance of Sahel States, a security and political cooperation framework formed between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger following their respective transitions, had been developing its own logic of collective sovereignty, a logic premised on the idea that these three countries, long treated as peripheral clients in a French-centered security architecture, could and should operate on their own terms. The Burkina Faso ultimatum, playing out in real time, became a case study in what that logic looks like under pressure. And the question being asked across the region was not whether Traoré was right or wrong by some abstract standard. The question was whether this kind of resistance to external deadline pressure could hold, and what the costs of holding would be. Is this a strategic repositioning with long-term structural support, or a high-risk confrontation that a landlocked, insurgency-pressured state cannot sustain alone? That question deserves a serious answer. Burkina Faso is not operating from a position of unchallenged strength. The country remains in the grip of a severe security crisis. Jihadist insurgent groups, including affiliates of both Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State operating across the Sahel, continue to control significant territory in the northern and eastern parts of the country. The humanitarian situation is acute. Millions of internally displaced persons, disrupted agricultural cycles, and humanitarian access constraints that have drawn international concern. The economy, while holding assets in gold and other minerals, faces structural vulnerabilities that any government, regardless of ideological orientation, would find difficult to manage under current conditions. The argument made by Traoré's critics, particularly those in Western capitals and among some segments of Burkina Faso's civil society, is that the country's pivot away from established Western security frameworks has neither resolved the security crisis nor produced measurable improvements in the lives of ordinary Burkinabe. The counterargument, made with equal conviction by Traoré supporters and by analysts sympathetic to the sovereignty framing, is that the preceding decades of French military partnership also failed to contain the insurgency, and that the terms under which that partnership operated imposed costs, economic, political, and strategic, that were simply not worth paying. This is the honest tension at the center of the Burkina Faso story, and it resists easy resolution. There is no version of this analysis that cleanly vindicates any single actor. What there is, instead, is a set of structural realities, a country that has been inserted into an external power architecture that it neither fully chose nor fully benefits from, a population that is increasingly vocal about demanding something different, and a government that has decided, whatever the risks, to make that demand official. The surveillance agreement dimension of the ultimatum deserves particular attention, because it points towards something that rarely gets examined with sufficient depth in mainstream coverage of Sahel politics. Intelligence infrastructure in West Africa is not simply about national security in the traditional sense. Surveillance agreements, including those that grant foreign governments or corporations access to communications data, monitoring infrastructure, or signal intelligence systems, have a dual character. They can enable counterterrorism cooperation, but they can also enable the monitoring of civil society, political opposition, labor organizers, and journalists. In contexts where the same external partners who claim to support security also have interests in preserving specific political and economic arrangements, the lines between security cooperation and political control become difficult to distinguish. When Traoré's government moved to restructure or terminate such agreements, it was, at a minimum, removing a set of tools that external actors had previously used to maintain visibility into Burkinabe political and social dynamics. Whether that move improves or worsens the country's actual security against armed insurgents is a separate question, and one that honest analysts acknowledge they cannot answer with certainty from the outside. What is clear is that the external response, including the ultimatum itself, suggests that those visibility tools were considered important enough to fight to preserve. That fact alone tells you something about what was actually at stake. The mineral contract dimension is no less significant. Burkina Faso holds substantial gold reserves and is among Africa's larger gold producers. The country's mining sector has historically been structured around concessions granted to foreign-owned companies operating under terms that critics, including Burkinabe economists and civil society advocates, have described as systematically disadvantageous. Royalty rates, profit repatriation rules, local content requirements, and environmental compliance frameworks have all been subjects of ongoing contention. When a government begins renegotiating those terms, demanding higher royalties, requiring more local processing, or simply reviewing the legality of existing concession arrangements, it directly challenges the financial interests of companies and their home governments that have built revenue models around the existing framework. The history of such renegotiations in Africa is long and instructive. It includes moments of genuine reform that improved national revenue flows. It also includes moments where renegotiation was used as political theater without substantive outcome, and moments where external retaliation, through investment withdrawal, credit downgrades, diplomatic pressure, or, in extreme historical cases, more direct intervention, followed quickly. Burkina Faso is now somewhere on that spectrum, and the direction it moves will depend on variables that no analyst can currently control or fully predict. What makes the current moment structurally different from previous episodes of sovereignty assertion in Francophone Africa is the regional context in which it is occurring. This is not an isolated case of a single government testing the limits of its autonomy. This is the third major Sahel state in as many years to make a decisive break with a post-independence framework of French-centered security and economic relationships. And unlike previous individual moments of rupture, which France and its partners could manage through bilateral pressure, regional isolation, or targeted diplomatic and economic incentives, the simultaneous realignment of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger creates a geographic and political bloc that is considerably harder to isolate or reverse. The alliance of Sahel states is not merely a rhetorical construct. It represents a combined population of roughly 70 million people, a contiguous territory that spans a critical belt of the African continent, and a shared security posture that has formally exited the ECOWAS framework, the Economic Community of West African States, which has historically served as a vehicle for regional diplomatic pressure aligned with French interests. Whether the alliance develops into a durable geopolitical entity or fractures under the weight of its members' internal challenges remains genuinely uncertain. But its existence changes the strategic calculus for every external power operating in the region. For France, the implications are particularly acute. The loss of military basing rights, intelligence partnerships, and commercial preferential access across 3 Sahel states simultaneously represents a structural contraction of French influence in West Africa that has no modern precedent. Paris has responded with a combination of public criticism, support for ECOWAS pressure mechanisms, and quiet diplomatic engagement, none of which has reversed the trajectory. The political dynamics within France, where the country's African policy has become increasingly contested domestically, add another layer of complexity to any sustained French response. For the United States, the picture is more nuanced. Washington has maintained a degree of engagement with transitional governments across the Sahel, driven largely by counterterrorism interests and concerns about the security vacuum that French withdrawal might accelerate. American drone bases in Niger, access agreements across the region, and intelligence partnerships built over years of counterterrorism cooperation all create incentives for cautious rather than confrontational engagement. But the broader framing of great power competition and the expanding Russian and Chinese footprint in the region creates pressure for a more assertive posture that sits uncomfortably alongside the stated American preference for democratic governance and civilian rule. For Russia, and specifically for the networks associated with the Africa Corps, the Sahel realignment represents a significant strategic opportunity. Russian engagement in the region offers Sahel governments a transactional security relationship that comes, at least explicitly, without the governance conditions and sovereignty constraints that Western security partnerships have historically imposed. Whether that engagement delivers actual security improvements is an empirical question with an as-yet inconclusive answer. What it clearly delivers is leverage for Russia in its broader contestation with Western powers, and leverage for Sahel governments in their negotiations with anyone. What happens next could redefine the entire architecture of security and sovereignty across West Africa. The domestic politics of the ultimatum refusal are worth examining carefully, because they reveal something important about the nature of Traoré's governance and the social compact he is attempting to build. Military-led governments in Africa have historically struggled to translate popular support for anti-colonial rhetoric into sustainable political legitimacy. The cheering crowds that greet the announcement of French troop expulsion tend not to remain cheering when electricity infrastructure deteriorates, when food prices rise, when the security situation in rural areas continues to worsen despite the change in external partners. Traoré knows this. His advisors know this. And the speed with which he ensured that the ultimatum refusal became a publicly visible, popularly mobilized moment suggests a deliberate effort to build a form of legitimacy that doesn't depend solely on security performance, but on the politics of dignity. That is a bet. It is not a guarantee. The citizens who gathered in public spaces across Burkina Faso in the wake of the ultimatum news were expressing something genuine. But genuine popular sentiment is not the same as durable political support, and the conversion of anti-colonial solidarity into effective state capacity The kind of capacity that actually reduces the territorial footprint of insurgent groups, actually delivers services to displaced populations, actually builds the economic conditions for young Burkinabe to have futures in their own country, is a project that no amount of sovereignty rhetoric can substitute for. The broader African continent is watching this dynamic with a mixture of inspiration and pragmatic concern. For a generation of African leaders, intellectuals, and activists who have spent years arguing that the post-colonial architecture of African governance is fundamentally distorted by external interference, the Burkina Faso ultimatum refusal is a data point that matters enormously. It demonstrates that a small, structurally vulnerable state can say no to the kind of deadline pressure that has historically produced compliance. It demonstrates that such a refusal can mobilize popular support rather than generating immediate political collapse. But it also raises questions that are not comfortable to ask within the solidarity framework. What are the security consequences for Burkinabe civilians of a strategic posture that has, so far, not produced measurable improvements in the counterinsurgency situation? What accountability mechanisms exist, if any, for a military government that claims a popular mandate it has never tested through electoral validation? And what does genuine sovereignty actually look like for a landlocked, aid-dependent state in a world where no country, not Russia, not China, not France, not the United States, offers partnerships without conditions? These are not questions that the ultimatum refusal answers. They are questions that the ultimatum refusal makes more urgent. The Sahel is at an inflection point that will shape the geopolitics of sub-Saharan Africa for a generation. The old architecture is breaking down. The new architecture has not yet been built. In that space, between the end of one order and the consolidation of another, countries like Burkina Faso are making bets about which direction history is moving, which partners are worth trusting, and which sacrifices their populations are prepared to sustain in pursuit of something that looks more like self-determination than the arrangements they are leaving behind. Ibrahim Traoré spent one night consulting advisors and regional allies before delivering his response. The response itself was calm. It was firm. And it was addressed not just to whoever issued the ultimatum, but to every government, institution, and power that has grown accustomed to African compliance under deadline pressure. Burkina Faso's sovereignty, he said, is not subject to external deadlines. Whether that sovereignty can be defended, consolidated, and eventually translated into genuine development and security for the Burkinabe people is the question that the next chapter of this story will answer. It will not be answered in a single speech or a single refusal or a single moment of street-level solidarity, however powerful those moments may be. It will be answered or not in the slow, grinding, unglamorous work of building a state that can actually protect and provide for its people without requiring them to choose between dignity and survival. That is the real ultimatum facing Burkina Faso now. And the clock on that one has been running for far longer than 24 hours.